This is RiverTalks with Jonathan Brush, President and CEO of Unbound.
I'm sick of teenagers. No, seriously, I really am. I get really frustrated with this whole idea in our culture and our society that there's this period of extended adolescence where we have people who are old enough and big enough and have enough skill to cause a lot of problems and to do a lot of things, and yet we don't expect them to do anything productive. And then we make this kind of overall excuse for them that they should act stupid and act irresponsible and do dumb things, and that we don't have to have a high expectation for the behavior. I don't really fully understand it, but I believe a lot in the power of expectations. I think that what you expect is so often what you get. And I think it's some sort of kind of universal truth. And I don't fully understand it, but I've certainly seen the effects and the impact of it lived out in my own life. Until I learned better, I spent some years working part-time as a junior high pastor. And I really just cannot tell you how many times parents, other pastors, other youth leaders would tell me, oh, that kid's really a problem. You're going to have so much of a problem with that kid. And they'd warn me and they'd just tell me it was really awful. And I would just go in with this expectation that that kid should adhere to the same kind of level of responsibility and behavior as everybody else who was in my youth group or at my event. And almost never was I disappointed. Now, occasionally there'd be a little bit of a testing and there'd be a little bit of a putting the toe across the line. And then you just clearly state the expectations again. Now, you realize that that's not totally universal, that there are certainly young people, teenagers, and for that matter, adults who absolutely cannot be reasoned with and who are just jerks and problems. But there is something really powerful about this idea of expectations, which is why, to me, it's such a tragedy that we live in this society that has such low expectations for our young people. The story that I tell all the time is that I'm really fascinated with history, and I particularly have an interest in 18th century naval history, which is ironic. I don't live close to the sea, and I'm not British, but the British Navy has a lot of really interesting history, and there's also a lot of really interesting historical fiction with Patrick O'Brien and C.S. Forster and the Hornblower series and all those. And so I've read that fiction, and I've read lots and lots of nonfiction from that era. And one thing that just really jumps out at you and will catch your attention every time is that there is a backbone of not just the British Navy, but of all of the world powers navies at that time, of an officer corps and then an enlisted corps. So you had a lot of pressed seamen who were there unwillingly, that would be the before the mast people, the folks that would run the ship and all that stuff. And then you had an officer corps, often pulled from the aristocracy, although the Navy was different from the Army in the sense that promotion was based in a large part to competence. There really wasn't room for incompetent leaders who didn't know their craft and didn't know what they were supposed to do on a ship. It's a bit unforgiving when you're at sea, and so there was an expectation of expertise. But that officer corps generally started with the rank of midshipman. And what's even more stunning is when you look at the age of midshipmen. So the British Navy ran an officer corps who started with midshipmen who had a typical starting age of between 12 and 14. Now, that means that in any typical naval ship of the time, in the British Navy or in other navies of the era, you would find 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds and 15-year-olds who would be leading grown men in many cases old enough to be their fathers and sometimes their grandfathers. And when I say leading them, they'd be leading them in battle. They would be expected to engage in personal combat, and they would be expected to have an extraordinary level of professional ability to run the most technologically advanced and most powerful instruments of warfare on the planet at the time. So there's plenty of documented historical instances where you had some 14-year-old who was assigned as the officer in charge of a prize ship. So you have a vessel sailing on the seas. Maybe they're clear over in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and they have an encounter with an enemy. And of course, at the time, you don't want to sink the other person's ship. You want to actually take the ship as a prize, because all of the crew get a portion of that prize money. And so you would take the ship, and then that ship and he'd sailed back to home port where it could be turned into a prize agent who would then pay out the crew. So everybody on the ship, from the captain down to the lowest seaman, has a real vested interest in this prize ship getting back to port safely. At the same time, you don't want to completely deplete the officer corps in the vessel. So generally what would happen is that midshipmen would be given the responsibility for taking the prize home. It was considered a way to get the prize back in competent hands and at the same time build skill and experience in those young officers. But let's just stop and think about this for a moment. You have a 14-year-old who may have just led a boarding party over the side of a vessel, leading men in combat, engaged in personal combat himself, captured the ship, worked on the repair party to put it back together, only to have the captain tell him that he was going to get a contingency of men, many of which would be twice as old as he is, and that he is to lead those men in sailing that vessel back across an ocean or two to their home port, probably while keeping tabs on a bunch of prisoners that were taken when they captured the ship. And this wasn't a happened occasionally type of thing. This was kind of standard operating procedure for the British Navy as well as all the other navies of the world at the time. Now, to our modern ears, I think that's just somewhat stunning, right? I mean, we think about, really? That 14-year-olds are fighting in battle? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating that we put guns in the hands of 12-year-olds and 14-year-olds and have them start fighting our foreign enemies. But to me, what's fascinating about that was the expectation, the level of expectation there, that this was considered to be normal, and so it was. And that these young men, who would not even be considered teenagers in some cases, were considered old enough and competent enough and responsible enough to do extremely extraordinary feats of skill and professionalism, of leadership, and of bravery. Now, to me, that is inspiring and thinking, what is it that I'm leaving on the table in terms of my expectations for my young people, the young people in my life, my own children, the students that I work with, the students in my church, the young people in my church and my community. I'm not interested in teenagers, these people that think that they have some period of extended adolescence where they are old enough to be responsible, but they are not expected to be so. I only believe in three kinds of people. I believe in children who need constant care and supervision for their safety and the safety of others. I believe in young adults, those who are able to accept some level of growing independence and growing responsibility, who are in a training apprentice stage on their way to becoming adults. Adults are people who are fully responsible and fully independent, able to take care of themselves and those placed in their care, and able to accept full responsibility for their actions. And as I think about being a parent, as I think about being a leader, as I think about being a teacher, I think about how am I moving the young people in my care through that process, from becoming children to becoming young adults, where they have an increasing expectation of responsibility and independence, to helping them become fully independent adults who will contribute to our world, to our society, and who will make a difference in the world.